Hello. I'd like to say a couple of things to you about surveys in the social sciences. Now, we can use surveys for a variety of things. We can test some hypotheses. We can examine differences among the population in terms of attitudes towards a wide variety of uh, social issues. And those include, but are not limited to, issues concerning race and ethnic relations, such as social distance. We can examine issues towards climate change, the environment, to crime, criminal justice policy, social policy, healthcare policy, what kind of economy should we have. All of these kind of questions can be examined using surveys. Now, it's important to note that those questions are generally attitudinal questions, and that thus they are at the individual level of analysis. They may be attitudes about social things or about macro levels of analysis, about political systems or about certain policies, or sometimes it's just about a candidate or a party, but they are the views of individuals. Now, these views then may become aggregated, but it's important to distinguish between the views of individuals and the thing itself. So this will come into light a little later. The fact that I have mentioned that surveys are often used to get a variety of data on an individual level analysis does not mean that surveys cannot yield data at institutional levels of analysis. In other words, institutions themselves can be surveyed. Representatives from those institutions can fill out those surveys, thus giving us a view of the institutions themselves. So, the surveys can either be used as primary data, and primary data here is what the researcher himself gathers. So if you are gathering primary data from a survey, that generally implies that you and your colleagues have together written the survey and administered the survey and then gathered that data, analyzed that data, etc. Or you can use secondary data with the survey. That means you can get access to data by surveys that have already been completed, that are made public, usually available on the internet. Things like the General Social Survey, which is a very famous one. Then you can analyze data from the General Social Survey from years to look at new hypotheses and relationships about attitudes and other sorts of data that you can gather from surveys, such as demographic data on race and so forth, income. All those kinds of data are gathered from surveys. So I'd also like to mention that the data gathered from surveys can then later be aggregated. And this aggregation allows us to use or to gather information on issues such as inequality. So how unequal is our society? How do we know that? Well, we can go to the Census Bureau and find out the income distribution. But of course, the Census Bureau got that data through questionnaires. And if you look at the American Community Survey, which is on the Census Bureau, then we find that that data, again on inequality, that they make public is an aggregated form of data that was actually gotten initially by people filling out surveys and disclosing their information about their income. So, hence what we have is income inequality is not an individual level variable. You can't ask an individual what is the inequality in your society. They can only report to you what their income is. But once you have an aggregate, then you can calculate the income inequality of those people that you have surveyed. And if you have used appropriate sampling techniques, you have an estimate of the income inequality of a society. So it's important to think of how the sampling technique is going to mix in with the data that you're trying to get. So, for example, the Survey of Income and Program Participation longitudinal panel study looked at 113 million households, and that produced information on social mobility. And social mobility is the idea or the concept that people can move up the income ladder or down the income ladder in some way. And generally in the United States, we have this idea that most of us move up. We kind of are brought up with this expectation that we'll live better than our parents. But what kind of data did this study actually yield? Well, it showed that the vast majority of people in the top income quintile didn't experience any mobility. So the rich stayed rich, basically. 71.2% of the top income quintile, which is 20% of our society, stayed rich over a 3-year period. And so was the case of 69% in the bottom income quintile. So the poor stayed poor. At least they stayed within those relative quintiles. Now, there may be movement within that quintile, or the rich may become much richer. And as a matter of fact, if you look at studies of inequality, that's precisely what has happened over the last several years. The rich have become much, much richer, while the poor have really stayed the same. So that kind of movement is not captured in this research here. All we are seeing is the movement among the 5 quintiles. So keep that in mind. But even this tells you there's a problem in our society in terms of social mobility. So most movement that happened were towards adjacent quintiles. So you do have some people who moved from the bottom quintile into the second poorest quintile. So from the poorest 19% to the poorest 22% of the population. Okay, that happens pretty regularly. People cross over to quintiles. But occasionally there are some big jumps. So for instance, 1% of the top fell to the very bottom, and 1.5% of the bottom went to the top. But it's kind of misleading if I'm going to tell you that in our society anybody can make it. I take somebody who grew up in a poor society, now he's doing fairly well, and I act as if that is the representative nature of our society, when that's only 1.5%. I mean, that means you've got a 98.5% of that not being your case. So think about that for a moment. Now, I would like to say a couple other things about surveys. There are a number of surveys we can use. They're self-administered questionnaire, which is a survey that a person fills out by themselves, or the researcher can administer that questionnaire, and that can be done face-to-face, by the telephone, and so forth. The advantages there is that you're more likely to get it done. There's some disadvantages that you will see as you go through the presentation. Namely, there's a bias that could be introduced because you're face-to-face, maybe they change their answers, and so forth, and it's more costly. But you're also more likely to have more people respond and have a better response rate. So that kind of sums up a lot of what you're going to see in the rest of this section. Now, I do want to mention that surveys are either cross-sectional or longitudinal. Now, remember, when we're talking about causality, cross-sectionality, or the quality of getting going over a geographic space and conducting a survey of a population over a wide geographic space, but at one moment in time, that will not allow us to determine cause and effect, because we don't have, or we have not fulfilled the temporal condition of causality. The longitudinal survey, much more expensive, does fulfill that condition, and the panel study done by the University of Michigan on income dynamics is a good example of a longitudinal survey that has yielded a wealth of information for social scientists. Please see the video that I have attached in this module for you to look at about that panel study. So now there are 2 different kinds of longitudinal studies. Longitudinal studies, that is a panel study, follows a particular group of people over time. A repeated cross-section just can give us a trend, but it can't tell us if individual A views have changed from point A to point B in time. So what we know is we can say, well, this policy is becoming more or less popular, and more people are open to this idea or less open to this idea than in the past. We can obtain that data with the repeated cross-section. We can't get that out of the cross-sectional data, but we don't know if they're the same people who are changing their views. You do get that if you do a panel study. Anyway, the last thing I wanted to mention is that surveys are characterized by both closed and open-ended questions. The closed questions allow you to conduct tests and do hypotheses, and the open-ended questions are really for qualitative, not really qualitative research, but they provide a little bit of depth that you don't get from the closed-ended questions, but they're not useful in terms of the numerical data. They can, however, be used to formulate new closed-ended questions in the future if a person is unsure of what kind of response categories they should provide as a researcher. Anyway, thank you very much, and see you again soon.